Villain for All Seasons. I'm Dan.
I'm Andrew.
I'm Ben.
Season 2, Episode 6. This week we're speaking with Peter Hitchens. Peter Hitchens is a journalist, broadcaster, author based out of the UK. He's also Christopher Hitchens' brother. Christopher Hitchens is probably more known to our US audience. Peter's also on the right. So, hey, you got to talk to everybody. I'm really excited about this. He's one of my favorite writers, and I hope you all enjoy this conversation. So, Peter, I want to kick things off with the elephant in the room is, do you think we'll see UK troops in Ukraine?
I have no idea. I'm not privy to the mind of the government. Nothing is impossible, but I think one of the real problems about that is there aren't very many British troops anymore anyway. So if there were, there wouldn't be a lot of them. And under what circumstances they would be sent? I mean, it's been widely suggested there have been British special forces there for some time, but I don't know whether that's true or not, and I couldn't say. But in any case, anything of that kind has always been deniable. Both the Russians and the United States and Britain would not want to acknowledge any kind of open clash between the forces of NATO countries and of Russia, because no one wants the war to expand outside Ukraine, which would then be a danger. What happens now, I really don't know. As I say, I'm about as little connected with the government of my own country as I am with the government of say, Venezuela. They don't like me, and I don't like them, and they don't tell me anything.
With that in mind, Peter, can you tell us a little bit about how we got here, this current conflict? I know you spent extensive time in Russia and even in Ukraine. You've even witnessed the downfall of the Soviet Union. I'd just like to get your take on the history of the conflict.
Well, it's very hard to fathom it, because at the time the Soviet Union collapsed, by a complete set of coincidences and providential events, I was actually there in Moscow when the Soviet Union fell, which most of the Western press corps were not, because they were on holiday. It was late August, and I, as I say, by sheer providence, had actually found myself there and saw it happen. And it's still burnt on my cerebral cortex that one of the things that happened was that the whole communist nature of Russia came to an end. A particular scene which I've never seen anyone else record, but which I definitely remember from the days after the pro-KGB putsch collapse in August, was to go around Moscow. It's quite warm, late summer weather. And in those days, Moscow's litter bins in the sort of more ornamental heart of the city were a kind of urn-shaped grey metal. And they were all full of burning Communist Party membership cards, partini biletti, the red and gold cards which people had to take out really to gain any kind of preferment in any chosen career or calling. And that had died. People had just given it up, and the Communist Party was dead, and that was its funeral. And I saw it. I say I've never seen that recorded anywhere else, but it really had a very profound impact on me. And not long afterwards, I was able to get permission to go to the Soviet naval port at Sevastopol in Crimea, which was a closed city at the time. But things were opening up a bit. And I and a few other Western journalists got in, and it was clear that the Soviet Navy, the huge global reach Navy, which Admiral Sergei Gorshkov had been assembling for about 40 years, was at an end, because many of the ships had simply been scuttled. They were lying in creeks and in the harbor, down by the bows and down by the stern, or just tilted over full of water. And they've doubtless been converted into washing machines by now. So the two very important parts of the whole Soviet structure, the Communist Party as its ideological base, and the attempt at global reach to rival the United States, had both visibly collapsed, and those things made a strong impression on me. And I am profoundly irritated when I hear people referring to Russia as if it was the Soviet Union. And also, these people never seem to look at a map, not for reasons of idealism, but simply because it was too weak and too poor. Russia, when it ceased to be the Soviet Union, pulled out of thousands, I think, of square miles of both Central Europe and Central Asia. And it just could not, as I say, out of the goodness of its heart, because it had to. And it was immensely, profoundly weaker, and therefore its influence and power and economic and military and diplomatic influence and its whole sphere of influence shrank immensely. And the opportunity which this gave in Europe for a new and peaceful order was immense. And I think at the beginning, an awful lot of the people who'd been engaged in the statesmanship between the Reagan and the first Bush administrations and Gorbachev wanted to achieve a kind of historic peace. But after quite a short time, a faction in the United States, particularly centered around, I think, Paul Wolfowitz, whose doctrine was leaked to the New York Times, I think in 93. This is very shortly after the fall of the Soviet Union, began to take the view that the policy of the United States should be that Russia should never rise again, and to act accordingly. And I think from that came the NATO expansion policy, which was pushed through the Senate with Bill Clinton's support around the same time, very much against the consensus of intelligent Western diplomacy at the time. And we now also know from the documents which have been assembled at George Washington University that it's absolutely beyond doubt that Western diplomats had promised verbally, there's no treaty, but they did promise that there wouldn't be any eastward expansion of NATO as a result of the Soviet withdrawal from the Warsaw Pact countries. It was just said it wouldn't happen. And then it did begin to happen, and it accelerated against increasing protests. There were all kinds of other features of this. The whole problem of the borders of the former Soviet countries, whether it be Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, etc., in the east, or Ukraine in the west, is that those borders had been, and indeed Georgia, those borders had been designed by Stalin. And they've been designed not to be the borders of functioning nations which could easily separate themselves from the USSR, but to be the borders of provinces. And most of them were saddled with minorities within their borders, which would protest against any move towards independence. And I think the same could be said to be true of Ukraine, whose borders contained at independence large numbers of ethnic Russians and people who looked eastwards rather than westwards for their loyalties and their culture. And so new countries were created which had inbuilt problems. Georgia's problem also with South Ossetia and Abkhazia mirror this on a much smaller scale. So it was complicated. And if you knew anything about it at all, you could see it was complicated. The other thing was, what was it that they were so worried about with Russia? And Russia was capable of becoming a functioning law-governed democracy in 1991. Just as Poland had been at the collapse of the communist regime shortly before. A very interesting thing is that the difference between the American approach to Poland and the American approach to Russia, the shock tactics used in economic reform in Russia, which in my view led partly to the disaster we have now, were not used in Poland. And Poland is now a highly prosperous and very successful country. I think Russia could have been the same. I think it's an immense wasted opportunity. And instead, this ridiculous doctrine of Russia is a terrible threat, and we must encourage the idea that Russia is a threat so that all its smaller neighbors are afraid of it, and create the idea that there is a danger. And out of this, as many people warned, particularly, as say, George Kennan, the most distinguished of all the Western diplomats who were still alive at the time this began, they all warned that this would be a folly and it would lead to a new Cold War, and it duly did. But it's not an ideological Cold War. I was a ferocious Cold Warrior. I miss it in a way because it was a clear moral divide. You knew that Reagan was right, especially if once you'd visited it, you knew the Soviet Empire was an evil empire. Russia is just a country. And it may not be a particularly pleasing country to our eye, but a lot of that is because it's lived for 70 years under the most hideous, murderous communist regime, which just destroyed its economy and destroyed its religion and destroyed its culture. So it was always going to be difficult to usher, I'm sorry about this rhyme, to usher Russia out of its misery into being a modern country. And I think the Western nations bungled it.
Peter, I want to talk a little bit about Putin and the rise of Putin. And we think about, pulling Russia right out after the Soviet Union. And he's really known for this Munich speech in 2007. As a reset, really, with relationship with the West. Can you talk a little bit about that Munich speech and really what went wrong?
Well, I think that by the time he gave the Munich speech, things had gone very seriously awry already. Putin wasn't a necessary part of Russian history. The whole business of Yeltsin, who was And I made this mistake, and I admit to it. When I was a Western correspondent in Moscow, I was captivated by Yeltsin. I thought he was a great, refreshing force, and I only later came to the conclusion that he was a corrupt drunk who did little but damage, and who was indulged very foolishly by the West during his time in power. And it was that indulgence, plus the rise of the oligarchs and the rape of the Russian economy, that led to Putin. I remember when going out to cover one of his first re-election, and talking not just, as most Western correspondents do, to the usual Russian liberals, who of course are very nice and long for a Western democracy, but don't really exist much outside Moscow, and talking to some more straightforward Russians, one of whom said to me, well, look, this man is actually restoring something like order to a country which had been reduced to complete corruption and chaos. Everybody's savings had been reduced to nothing. Gangsterism and crime and the most sort of piratical form of capitalism was abroad. They'd lost their jobs. Their cities were disorderly and crumbling. The pensions were not being paid. Along comes somebody who puts these things right. What do you expect if people say, actually, that might not be such a bad idea? I don't, like anyone, I can see the disadvantages. I was one of the earliest people in I think 2004, I wrote an article about Putin's election and about him, suggesting he was a menace to freedom long before most people knew how to spell his name. But it doesn't make any difference. A lot of this was the result of Western policy before that point. And one of the key people who, during the election, when I remember being told that Putin was going to be preferred by normal Russians, was a man called Stanislav Gavrilyukin. Now, Gavrilyukin had made two tremendous films, which I had watched at the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union. One was called Tak Zhit Nельзя, which means we can't go on living like this. And I remember attending a showing of it in Moscow in the summer of 1990. And it was the first time that a film in Soviet cinema had actually shown the squalor and crime and corruption and misery of Soviet life. And everybody in the cinema around me, it was the Cosmos cinema in a rather pleasant part of northwest Moscow, everybody around me in the cinema was weeping, because it was the first time they'd seen the truth about their country expressed on a screen in a mass medium. And they made another one called Россия, которой мы потерялись, the Russia we have lost, which was again a documentary about what Russia might have been if there had not been a Bolshevik revolution, and the tragedy of Bolshevism. So you couldn't call Stanislav Gavrilyukin, who's the friend of Alexander Solzhenitsyn, you couldn't call him a friend of reaction or of tyranny or any manner of means. He was the reverse of those things. But he said of Putin's election against and his replacement of Yeltsin, at least under Putin, we will return to normal corruption. And it's a devastating thing to say, and he said it, and that was how people felt. But Putin was the creation of the West. Remember, in the early 1990s, when Yeltsin actually used tanks to open fire on his own parliament, and he was applauded in the West for doing this. Remember when Yeltsin came up for re-election, and I think it's pretty certain that an awful lot of Western money was spent on saving his bacon when he would otherwise have lost. The West was deeply involved in maintaining the corrupt rise of the oligarchs and the Wild East period of Russia out of which Putin arose. So it's not, to me, very convincing when people say, oh, well, we think Putin's terrible. Always ask yourself what part your country's leaders played in creating the circumstances which caused him to rise. He wasn't necessary. He wasn't inevitable. But now we've got him. And by the time it came to the Munich Security Conference, a lot of what he said was simply true. NATO had expanded enormously far east when it had said it wouldn't do this. And what was this alliance for? It had started out life in the 1940s as a defensive alliance, but ever since it had bombed Serbia in 1999, it was an offensive alliance, and it ceased to have the defensive label it used to have. Again, I mentioned Solzhenitsyn. Solzhenitsyn was one of the Russians most outraged by NATO's bombing of Yugoslavia. Many Russians took this as a sign that they were now in some way the enemy, despite having gone through a revolution which had attempted at least to create the first Russian democracy since Lenin snuffed it out in 1917.
Peter, did you Did you see that as a turning point in NATO, the Yugoslavia bombing?
Honestly, I didn't understand it at the time. I never understood Yugoslavia at the time. I still don't. I think I'm groping towards it, but I simply didn't know. I was instinctively, I was against the Kosovo War, but I found it quite hard to explain my instincts. But something in me saw it as a mistake, and looking back on it, I can now see that my instincts were broadly correct. This wasn't a wise course to take. But how exactly it was that Yugoslavia came to break up and how it came to break up in the way that it did, and why and how Western forces were deployed as they were to create the outcome we now have, is a history which seems to me not to have been written yet. So until it is, I'm keeping quite quiet about it. But I think it was momentous things took place in Yugoslavia, which I didn't really. The Cold War had been simple. The collapse of the Soviet Union had been simple, but the great Balkan spider's web, which then develops, I've always struggled with, but it certainly seems to me to have been in many ways, particularly for the people living there, a change for the worse.
Back to Putin real quick. Peter, I'm just wondering, do you see, as many in the West now kind of posit, that Putin is an ideological leader to be admired by people on the right? And I mean people on the right being Le Pen in France, Orban in Hungary, and then obviously we're having there's suggestions that Donald Trump has affinities for him, etc.
Well, I don't know what ideology that would be. I mean, these people aren't church-going Anglicans, are they? I don't. What is it that unites them exactly? A number of ideas have been exiled by the current dominant ideology. And some of those ideas are ideas that I support, but the fact that that someone like Marine Le Pen or the AfD or someone borrows or pillages or utilizes such ideas doesn't mean that they believe in them, or that I would ever vote for Le Pen or the AfD or Orban. I don't trust or like these people. If your ideas have been exiled, then was the line from the Ballad of Reading Gaol, his mourners will be outcast men, for outcasts always mourn, and political outcasts are always in mourning. They're always on the edge of things, and they will, if they're not careful, they'll find themselves looking for friends among all kinds of weird people. I strongly advise them not to do so. An idea is not destroyed because it's embraced by a bad person. But if you support a bad person because he embraces an idea which you love, then I think you make a big mistake. So I don't see any ideology there which unites these people. They're just on the margins of the what you might call the sort of Euroland idea of a supranational, politically, socially, and morally liberal empire, which is without an emperor, which is what the European Union is, and what to some extent the United States has been. And as outsiders, they appear to be together because they're not part of that mainstream. But I don't think there's really anything there which could be called ideological. Putin's not an ideological, really. He's an old-fashioned despot who becomes more powerful as he becomes more dictatorial, and he just gathers more and more power to himself. But it's not for an ideological end that I can see. What is it? What would you call it?
I mean, do you think that is the ideology? Simply to become a despot, simply to...
Well, that's not an ideology, is it?
Sure.
And power is power is power, and eventually you die, and then that power is either handed on to somebody else or dissipated, but you have no control over what will be done with it. An ideological state, it serves an ideology, and the people who obtain power in it obtain that power on condition that they abide by that ideology, and when they die or retire, their successors follow it. Whereas none of us has the faintest idea what will happen to Russia when Putin dies, which of course one day he will.
Peter, I want to go back to Ukraine, and speaking of ideology, what do you think the ideological purpose of this war was? And I know that you, in my opinion, rightly opposed the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, but those did have the ideology of, however lame this is, bringing freedom to those countries. So,
well,
criticism,
it's a form of utopianism. It's a form of utopianism. I've had to think about this because my late brother, who was a fervent Marxist-Leninist, and I think probably to the end of his days an admirer of Leon Trotsky and of Karl Marx, ended up on very good terms with Paul Wolfowitz, who I mentioned earlier, and also I think was a welcome guest at George W. Bush's White House. It's an extraordinary thing, and it needs explaining. And also, he was an enthusiastic supporter of the Iraq War, and he was a utopia, and he switched his utopianism away from the collapsed ideals of Marxism-Leninism and towards the new liberal world order, which uses terms such as democracy and liberation. I think another element in what drove him was he was very much a supporter of the Cultural Revolution, and I think that any supporter of the Cultural Revolution must look at Islam with particular trepidation, because it stands very hard against most of the things that Cultural Revolution is in favor of, much more so, in fact, than Christianity, which is a pretty busted flush in terms of moral influence in the Western world. So when this liberation, which was being proposed by George W. Bush and Paul Wolfowitz, took American power into the lands of Islam, I think he saw a combination of things which he found rather inspiring. And I could see that and agree with it, of course, as you'll be aware, but I could see that he'd found a new home for his longings. Utopianism is ultimately about longing, just as a religion is about longing, but he didn't have any religion. He had, for one reason or another, broken with religion probably around the age of 11 or 12 and would have nothing more to do with it. So he transferred those longings to, first of all, to left-wing utopianism of the old-fashioned sort, though he was quite sophisticated in that, being opposed to the more despotic aspects of Leninism and very much mistrusting Stalinism, but he was nonetheless a left-wing revolutionary. And then when that god failed, as fail it did, he found a new one in trying to reform the whole world. But on this occasion, backed up by the aircraft carriers and tanks and aircraft of the United States of America, of which he became an enthusiastic citizen at the same time. I think he epitomizes that change and was one of the most clear-minded makers of it. But I think an awful lot of other left-wing people made similar changes, but they weren't as coherent or as abrupt.
Peter, do you ever think if Christopher would have supported Libya, Syria, and now Ukraine? And also, have you ever seen his debate with George Galloway over Iraq?
I think, yes, he probably would. And in fact, I have very little doubt of it. He could get very worked up indeed about Vladimir Putin while he was still with us. And I seem to remember similarly about Gaddafi. I don't think I've ever seen a full exchange between him and George Galloway. I've seen excerpts from it, but if there is a full version of it, I haven't been able to find it, or perhaps haven't tried hard enough.
I'll send it to you after the interview. It's a great watch.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. I mean, there was Galloway is. It's difficult for me. Occasionally, I run into George in broadcasting studios, and he's always perfectly friendly to me, and I to him, because I believe in being civil to opponents. We mainly disagree about his ridiculous worship of communist despotism. The last time I had an exchange with him, he was trying to defend the Bolshevik Revolution, which is indefensible. He also tried to defend, I think, the Fidel Castro regime to me. We never discussed the Iraq business, and I would have felt it would have been a sort of family treachery if I had done. So I was steered away from that.
Peter, I want to talk a little bit about being on the right and not supporting interventions, like the ones we've seen in Iraq and Afghanistan and obviously Ukraine. Can you bring up your history as a Trotskyist and how you've really made the switch from, maybe supporting the left-wing intervention that you mentioned with Christopher and, being less enthusiastic about it now, even though you're on the right?
But you see, I stopped being utopian. Instead of being a utopian, I became a Christian. And I'd seen, there's a famous instance in this country, I'm sure in the United States there are similar ones, a man called Douglas Hyde, who had been very active and militant communist, who then gave it up and became a very active militant Roman Catholic. And I thought was a mistake to move from one set of dogmatic positions to another. I thought one of the reasons for leaving Marxism-Leninism was that its dogmas were simply too concentrated and too beguiling, and that one should look for something much more reasoned. And so I chose quite deliberately the Church of England, not the institution that stands before us, but the body which is represented in the Book of Common Prayer and the Authorized Version of the Bible. I chose the Church of England precisely because it was not ferociously dogmatic. It was insistent upon this combination of tradition, scripture, and reason, which made it much more retiring in debate and much more ready to tolerate and accept the virtues of opponents than dogmatists so often are. So I made a complete switch, which he didn't do at all. He went from one utopia to another, around the back, as it were, of wherever utopias are. And I didn't. I left the quest for utopia. So just as revolution no longer appeals to me, nor does intervention. And when I see those horrible films on the television of towns in the Middle East, or indeed Eastern Europe, being rocket bombed by whoever it is, I just feel a sense of disgust. I don't think that this is a way in which civilized human beings ought to be behaving, whichever side they're on.
Peter, I want to talk a little bit about religion just before we leave the topic. I know that you've mentioned in a previous interview how you think the church aligning with the war effort in the First World War really did damage to its reputation. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, yes, the greatest event of the First World War was the Christmas truce on the Western Front in Christmas 1914, when British and German soldiers, hearing each other singing the same carols on Christmas night, climbed out of their trenches and fraternized, because they, unlike the people who sent them there, were discovered that they had in common a loyalty to Christian Europe, which was, of course, opposed to what they were doing. And my great wish is that this, instead of being contained and dying quietly away within 36 hours, had spread to the whole of the war front, and all of them had simply climbed out of the trenches and gone home. And what a great pity that they didn't. But the problem was that the churches called this a great war for civilization. And of course it wasn't. And anybody who knows anything about how it was fought, whether one talks in detail about the disgusting life in the trenches surrounded by the corpses of your friends being eaten in front of you by rats, and the killing of prisoners, which nobody talks about, but which they did. You read Robert Graves's Goodbye to All That, he makes no bones at all about the unlawful killing of prisoners of war, the frightful things which happened when men came across each other face to face without guns, the terrible clubbing and biting and gouging which took place, the reduction of civilized men, the brought up in the Victorian age to be gentle and virtuous, to cavemen. And all this horror, and then also the techniques used. It's very few British people now know that one of the reasons we eventually won that war, apart from the fact that the United States came in on our side, was that we starved the Germans to death in many, many cases. Women and children had no food to eat because of our blockade, which we did not end immediately the war was over either. So both the techniques that we used and the experience of fighting had so corrupted those who took part that to be told by the church, which was supposedly the Church of Christ, that these were good actions, I think must have set off in the brain of any thoughtful person a series of explosions, which must have made it impossible to maintain the faith that you'd had before.
Peter, I think this is a good segue into talking about the media's role in promoting conflict, like the ones we've seen in Ukraine, and then obviously Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, the list goes on. I'm curious about your thoughts on how they present Ukraine, and I'm also curious about your thoughts kind of in juxtaposition, or maybe in continuance, how they present the Israel-Palestine conflict.
Oh, dear. Well, look, you can. I mean, there are intelligent things written about these things. But the problem with news is that it's driven by events, and television news is, of course, driven by spectacle. And these things are inimical to thought and consideration. So mass media are almost instinctively going to like war. It just is. It's a stimulus to the things on which they live, and I'm not surprised by that. I'm not even particularly critical of it. I think the media have made any of these. The people who made them are elsewhere. They've made them quietly in back rooms. They're the people I blame.
Peter, do you feel Israel has won the conflict? I think militarily, we can say that through the total destruction of Gaza, they have. However, I think myself and many others would argue Israel's world standing has never been lower.
Well, it's just the point that I made when this happened, when the horrible October the 7th pogrom took place. And it was perfectly obvious to anybody who looked that this was not, these events had not been triggered because people were impatient about Israel's attitude towards the two-state solution or over some detail of negotiation between Israel and the Palestinian Authority. This was sheer, straightforward hatred of Jews. And it was a pogrom. And therefore, the response to it by Israel was crucial. How would Israel actually answer it? And the answer was boneheaded. Many times, and I've repeatedly opposed them, many times I've seen Israeli governments bombard Gaza, a place I've been to, by the way, and it is just so stupid. You cannot bombard Gaza without killing innocent people in quite large numbers. You just can't do it. It wouldn't ever be possible. How is this an answer? And I said at the time, Israel's answer should be to turn to the world with its arms spread and say, we can't behave like this. We're not going to. I mean, no one would have minded, I think, if the Israeli Air Force had found the apartments of Hamas's real leadership, who I believe are in Qatar, and rocket bombed them in their homes. And everybody thought it was quite reasonable if they'd hunted them down with death squads. That would have been something approaching a sort of justice. But to respond to this deliberate killing of civilians by it's not deliberate. I dislike many of the words that are used to describe this, but to respond to it by a military action which was bound to lead to the deaths of innocents on a large scale was both a foolish response, and also it was because it was never going to work. And anybody, have you seen the Gilles Pontecorvo's great film, The Battle of Algiers?
Of course, one of my favorites.
Because everybody involved in this sort of politics should have seen it, and its message is quite clear. You can be as tough as you like and kill as many people as you like, and you can resort to torture if you want to. You will not defeat a movement of this kind. It's just what you will think that you have, maybe for a few months, but very shortly afterwards it will rise again. That you can't fight wars of this kind with high explosive and muscle. It doesn't work, and it never will. It never has. But they didn't seem to be aware of this. And my previous respect for Benjamin Netanyahu's intelligence melted away during those weeks when he did this. And it's the other thing, of course, is that Israel has always depended for its existence upon the support, particularly of the United States, but to a lesser extent of the European and other Western countries. And that support, to the extent it existed, was partly sustained by a popular understanding of the need for a Jewish state. And actually, the October the 7th pogrom demonstrated the need for a Jewish state. Again, if anybody was in any doubt, there are people who hate Jews so much that they have to have somewhere to go in refuge. To escape from such people, that's the ultimate argument against which I've never heard an effective counter. But if you want to sustain such a state, you need to have lots of friends, because in this world, you're certainly going to have a lot of enemies, and much of the Arab world will be your enemy most of the time. So to sacrifice those enemies sacrifice those friends, I should say, sacrifice those friends in the long term for a short-term satisfaction of taking revenge upon Gaza it's straightforwardly stupid. And I'm amazed at how people so seldom grasp the enormous role which stupidity plays in international affairs and national affairs too, but this was stupid. The long-term support for Israel in the United States, which is without which I don't think Israel can long survive, has, I think, been permanently weakened, and we will see over the coming decades what an important difference that makes.
Peter, I mean this respectfully. Has this shaken any of your conviction of being a Zionist?
Well, no, because as I say, my Zionism is quite simple. It's as I said, that the massacre of Jews in supposedly civilized Europe in the middle of the 20th century and the complete failure of most of the civilized world to provide refuge to those who were being massacred is the ultimate argument. It's for the existence of a state of Israel, which controls its own borders and could let refugees in under these circumstances. There is no gainsaying that. And I still think that's true. But that doesn't absolve us all from worrying about how on earth you sustain such a state. Israel is not unique in the world in being founded on the dispossession of others. The United States is founded on the dispossession of the Native Americans. Australia is founded on the dispossession of the indigenous people of Australia. And they, as it were, seem to escape criticism for this, which is another interesting subject I won't go into. But the truth is that Israel starts off unpopular in a large part of the world. And if that unpopularity isn't balanced by a rational understanding of the need for its existence in the rest of the world, then it won't survive. So it hasn't shaken my belief that Zionism is the only answer to the insoluble conundrum of homicidal anti-Semitism. I don't know what drives it. I can't explain it. I wouldn't attempt to, but I do know with absolute certainty that it exists, that it has existed in the last century, that it could exist again. And what is going to be our response to it when it happens again if there's no state of Israel? So that's the basis. But to do that isn't to license every action of the state of Israel. And it's one of the glories of the state of Israel that so many of its citizens are fierce opponents of the policies of its government, and rightly so. As much of the best history, critical history of Israel, has come from Israeli historians who've pointed out just how brutal the dispossession and ethnic cleansing were in 1948, which previously was denied, of course, by Israel, but it's now Israeli historians who've shown this to be true. And quite right, too. This criticism has to come from Israelis for it to be fully accepted by those who support Israel. But it's the case. This is not a perfect country. And it is open to huge amounts of criticism, but some actions that it's taking and has taken recently certainly seem to me to be indefensible. It doesn't mean Zionism is indefensible, though. It just means that the actions of the existing government, there are all kinds of complicated things about Israeli politics. Part of the country seems, for a start, to have a constitution designed by its enemies, as so many other countries do too. But no, it doesn't. It doesn't at all, because I think that ultimately the world needs a country which can offer refuge to Jews from any future outbreaks of homicidal hatred of Jews.
Peter, just to make a distinction between Hamas and Palestinians, do you feel that Palestinians do have a right to resist? And if so, what do you think is the ideal way for them to resist?
I don't know what a right to resist would be. I don't think I'm not sure how one codifies such things. I think it's much more important if you were actually trying to achieve some kind of viable peace in the region, to concentrate not upon political objectives, but upon what do we care about? Do we care about some paper settlement, or do we actually care about the lives of the people there? I've been to the region more times than I can count. I like the people there on both sides of the divide, and I feel for them. One of the best initiatives was about, I suppose, 20 years ago, when one of the Palestinian leaders concentrated almost entirely upon the economic betterment of the people in the West Bank, and this succeeded. Salam Fayyad, that's his name. So it's succeeded to a great extent. You go up to Ramallah recently. I haven't been for some years now for one reason or another. But the last time I went, it was a prosperous, cheerful place of shopping malls and cinemas and people living reasonably cheerful lives. And I thought when I saw this, that if we could concentrate upon achieving this, then that would be good. It's the insistence, both in the Arab world and in the West, ever since really Count David, I suppose, in trying to achieve a final resolution where everybody agrees that there will be, for instance, two states. I think one of the things October the 7th proved beyond doubt was two-state solutions unworkable. That you couldn't use. What if the Arab state, which would under existing borders be incredibly close to the absolute center of Israel, to all its most crucial facilities, what if that state turned into Gaza, and the border between them became the front line of a war of the kind which showed its face on October the 7th? It's not possible. So I'm very much in favor of the not being a final peace. Apart from anything else, I doubt very much whether any Arab leader in the region could sign such a thing, because he would be regarded as a traitor to his cause. But I think if you just ameliorate the conditions of the people, make it more and more possible for them to mix, to work alongside one another and live alongside one another without aiming for such aiming for any solution, then I think you would get a lot further. As so many things are actually demonstrated in the wonderful Lewis Carroll book Alice Through the Looking Glass, where you have to do all the running you can to stay in the same place, and you get to the garden by walking in the opposite direction. I think if you walked away from trying to get a resolution in the Middle East, you might get one. If the harder you work for it, the less likely you are to achieve it.
Peter, do you think that's possible in a post-October?
Probably not. But since you asked me, I'm saying that's what I think. It's not possible because most people in politics and diplomacy are quite thick and not very interested, and it doesn't seem to occur to them, and they will carry on doing the same thing over and over again, even though it keeps on failing.
Peter, I want to talk about the only country I think I've heard you really express concern over, and that's China. Can you explain why you really see them as, I don't know if an adversary is the right word, but what is the ideal outcome for you in dealing with China?
Oh, look, my view of other countries is that there are other countries. They do things differently there. I may not like it. They may not like what I do, but it really is not all that much of my business. But I think people should be alert to the nature of China before getting too close to it and allowing it to dominate their economies too much. I think we've been quite unwise in opening up our trade to China as much as we have. And I'm still not entirely convinced that the Nixon visit to Peking was a good thing. China, there was a time when I seemed to be going there every few months, and I found it immensely exhilarating because it is so huge. It's so different. It's like being on another planet. And also terrifying because of the enormous economic and political power that was being generated by the rise of this new economy. And just going up to Inner Mongolia and seeing the coal trains going past again, mile after mile after mile, them fueling this huge industrial revolution. It's thrilling, and it is an enormous development in the modern world, which I'm very pleased to have seen. But it's not. If it succeeds on its own terms, it's not going to be very nice, because it doesn't have in it seems to me, any of the traditions or forces which tend towards gentleness or tolerance in its politics. So people should be wary of it. But I'm the last person to want to whip up another war scare.
Peter, I want to talk a little bit about you're traveling as a journalist. One of my favorite book of yours is Short Breaks in Mordor. Can you tell us a little bit about, do you still travel often for work? And,
no,
I pretty much stopped.
I pretty much stopped. It was exhausting. I felt that each time I did it so intensely that I felt that I'd reached my verdicts on the place concerned. I didn't want to go back and do it again, even if it had changed substantially. I felt that that was what I thought when I thought it. That was the state of my education at the time that I'd written it. I don't mind people saying, well, this is out of date now, because of course it is. It's out of date as soon as you write it. What I was concerned about was that it contained long-term truth, that anybody who read it could see that it was true of its time and also true of all time. And that's the point of writing about these things, that it's explaining how people behave, how the world works as far as you possibly can, with the huge benefit and privilege given to me of being able to travel with superb assistance of brilliant translators and fixers of it who helped me achieve these things, and also a fantastic photographer who accompanied me around China several times, who knew it far better than I, and I gained so much from that. But so no, I've stopped doing it now. Also, it made a huge hole in my family and private life. Each of those journeys took a lot of preparation, and then a lot of time to do, and then a lot of time to get over with, and it makes the sort of linear life, which the member of a family really ought to be living, rather difficult. And I do, although I love the fact that I did it, and I like the book that you like as well. It's I have the only hardback copy had bound, because nobody would publish it in Britain. But there was a price paid, a personal price paid, as always is in these things. Not a desperately high one, but one which I didn't want to continue paying. So I've stopped. And I now hate flying so much that I would do almost anything to avoid it. It really annoys me that there is no railway tunnel from England to Ireland, because I love Ireland, but you almost have to go. I know there are boats, but you almost have to go there by airplane. I don't go anymore. I hate flying. I'm the most ill adapted foreign correspondent there ever did. I hate leaving home. I hate flying. I long to be at home all the time away.
I do remember,
and I don't like Chinese food either. Whenever I went there, the only thing I ate was Singapore fried rice noodles and beer, because this is the only thing I could eat. And my friend Rex, my translator and fixer, said immediately, "Fixer, it's the consistency of it you don't like, isn't it?" And he was right. But it's a nuisance if you're abroad. In Japan, I could live in Japan if I only like the food. I'd learn Japanese, but I just don't. So and also, there's the other point, of course, they wouldn't have me.
Peter, do you have a favorite place you visited?
I'm so sorry. Could you ask that again?
Do you have a favorite place that you visited?
Oh, many of them are favorite places. There's so much surprising beauty that you know you'll never see again, or if you visit it again, it won't strike you in the same way as it won't be the first time. Even North Korea has great beauty in it, and it was thrilling to be there and see it. The drive north, we took one of our 2 trips out of Pyongyang on a lovely sunny September day, which was turned out to be Chuseok, the North Korean autumn festival, when everybody goes and decorates family graves. And because it's a sort of dynastic worship, the regime has no objections to it. And we were driving out, and all alongside us, there were thousands of people on bicycles. You can, in fact, get a whole family onto a bicycle, and they did, pedaling out to their ancestors' graves to decorate them. And on either side of the road, the most beautiful wildflowers, which had obviously been planted to make it look lovely. I remember that. I'd quite like to see that again, but it probably isn't so anymore. And Pyongyang itself, because it was at that time no traffic, was the most lovely, peaceful city. I remember finally getting my 14th floor hotel room window to open, which was some struggle, and looking out over the moonlit city. And it was totally silent. There was no traffic except for one man singing about a mile away, and he was obviously drunk. And that's another memory I have of Pyongyang. Bhutan, which is on the cusp, they just introduced television when I went there, is wonderfully beautiful. Mountains are extraordinarily exhilarating, and that must be one of the most beautiful places I've ever seen. But so many places are. It's such a piece of of good fortune to have been able to see any of these places as I have done. There's huge amounts of beauty in the world, often in places of great conflict, because, of course, the places people fight hardest over are the most beautiful ones.
Peter, before we get back to Starmer, which I really want to talk to you about, I just had one more personal question to ask you, and that's about your writing style. I really, really enjoy it. Can you talk a little bit about your influences and what you really think is the future of journalism?
I have no idea about what the future of journalism is. I hope greatly that somehow we'll find a way of continuing to publish things on paper so that people will read things on paper rather than on screens, because I think that is fundamentally different. I also hope that books survive in the form that they've existed all my life, because there's something different about that and the containment of thought in ink and paper. I don't really know what the influences on my style have been. I don't want to claim any famous names because that's pretentious. I think that I've just been disciplined by working for popular newspapers to be straightforward. And I hope that I've also been disciplined by a desire to be honest. But beyond that, the principles I return to are the ones everybody returns to who knows anything about this, which are the ones set out in George Orwell's Politics in the English Language. But even they have at the bottom break all these rules rather than doing something outright barbarous. So there are no rules. But I think one thing I would say to anybody is read it out loud to test it. I read in church this morning the parable of the sower, and I don't think I'd ever read it out loud in all my life before. I must have read it, as it were, in my head and on the page 30, 40 times, heard it read out in church, who knows how many times. But reading it, and this I should add is, of course, in the authorized version of the Bible, none other will have this effect. It had me almost in tears.
I believe you were a King James, man,
Yeah.
right? Yes.
Yeah.
Totally.
We call it the authorized version, but I mean, it's. I know you guys call it the King James. It's okay. You can call it what you like. It is associated with him, but he didn't write it.
Before we get to Starmer, I bogarted this entire interview. So Ben, Andrew, do you guys want to jump in and ask Peter anything?
Well, I know we're getting back into Starmer too, and talking back potential end to the war in Ukraine. And I was just wondering if you had a reaction to the pretty universal reaction of the world to Trump opening up dialogue with Putin and Russia. And it's been really astounding to me that there has been a pretty homogenous reaction that it's just a blanketly a bad thing. And I wonder what your general reaction is to that, and also maybe do you think that is specifically because of the messenger it's coming from being Donald Trump? Do you think anybody else wanting to have, normalized relations with Russia would get that kind of pushback?
Well, I never saw it, the policy of NATO expansion or the deliberate irritation of Russia, which was pursued by previous American administrations, as being a particularly sensible policy for the United States. I couldn't see any rationality for it. As I say, it seemed to me that foreign policy in this area had been captured by that small faction, the same people who gave us the Iraq War, the Utopians, the Project for a New American Century lot. And it's always struck me that sensible American policy would be to get out. And it's also the case, and I don't criticize the United States for this in itself, that there's a fairly long list of places the United States has got involved in and then, as it were, got bored or found that it wasn't getting anywhere very much, Vietnam being the biggest example of this, and has just pulled out, leaving the place in ruins. So I don't know whether any of you have read a rather fine newish novel called The Wizard of the Kremlin by Giuliano da Empoli.
No.
Well, you should. It's very. It's some of it is obviously thinly disguised reality, but there's a character in it discussing Ukraine who says, "Well, this is a high Kremlin official saying, well, it's always the same. You rely on the West, and then you come to a bump in the road, and they dump you, and you're left with a demolished country. And here we go again. I think it was very foolish for a lot of people to think that this would be any different. It was always a question of how it would end. You couldn't have, because of Russian nuclear weapons, you couldn't have a direct war between the United States or NATO and Russia, because if it went wrong, then it could lead to a nuclear exchange, and nobody wants that. So it could only be mounted as a proxy war in which Ukraine was the battering ram, which the United States used against Russia. And the problem with that is that Ukraine is not equipped, doesn't have the people or the economy or indeed the general resources or resilience to defeat Russia. I mean, Russia is not an immensely strong conventional power. In fact, it's quite weak, but it's capable of certainly, if not of defeating Ukraine, of doing it such substantial damage that Ukraine can't ever get back what it's lost. So there you have it. Unless you wanted to expand it into a Russo-American war with the possible end of being a nuclear exchange, that's how it's going to have to end, isn't it? So it never seemed to me that it was going to end well for anybody. And the people it was always going to be worst for were the poor Ukrainians who've been used. What baffles me watching it come to an end, if it is coming to an end, which pray God it does soon, is that so many people seem to want to keep it going. And what's in it for them? What good's it? It's ruined Germany's economy. It's caused almost every European nation to spend enormous amounts of money they don't have on sending weapons to a war in which they have no interest. What's it for? So there's all that. I forgot what your question was really, but it doesn't seem to me to be particularly surprising that it's come to an end, or particularly regrettable. Zelensky, who I've never been dismissive of or rude about, has often carried himself, I think, rather nobly, but he has a terrible position. He was elected, people forget this, as a peace president.
Mm-hmm.
His peace initiative was destroyed by his predecessor, Petro Poroshenko, and by the ultra-nationalists of the West, who called this a capitulation and campaigned against it and destroyed it. He was left as president without a foreign policy, so he ended up as a war president. Now, if he were to sign a peace deal, then he would fall within seconds, I think, because there are so many people in Ukraine who would not support it, who would call it a capitulation, and would love to sacrifice him for their principles. So he knows that. So in some ways, Trump's doing him a favor. Whether Trump is doing this out of intelligence and calculation, or simply because he's bored, I don't know, because I don't know him. I've never met him. I know as little about him as anybody does who reads about him. He reminds me slightly of Huey Long, but I think Huey Long was more intelligent than Trump. I think Trump is not intelligent, but he is fantastically cunning. There are people who can beat you at chess. He's not one of them. And the people who will always beat you at noughts and crosses, and he is one of them. So he's cunning, and I think his cunning sees there's no future in the Ukraine war for the United States, so out they come. But what's so bad about that? Do people want more Ukrainians to die? Do they want more Ukrainian cities to be burnt and flattened? Do they want more and more of Ukraine to have to cope every day without electricity? Is this a good thing? Do they want to extend the war? Do they want to have a permanent military confrontation in Eastern Europe until the end of time? What is it that they want? What was the purpose of it? What was the purpose of expanding NATO up to the borders of Ukraine? What was the point of it? What was it going to do that was going to make anything better for anybody? I can't see it. I mean, just look, here's a simple thing. If the United States had lost the Cold War and the Soviet Union had triumphed, and as a result, the United States had lost all the land which it conquered in 1848, which would be a rough equivalent of what happened to the Soviet Union in 1991. And there was now the San Diego naval base was held by Mexico, and Mexico allowed the Soviet Navy to base in it. What would be the response, even of a truncated, defeated United States to that? You don't even need to ask.
Peter, I want to talk a little bit about Starmer, and he'll be in Washington, I believe, this week. And then
So they tell me, yeah, thrilling for you. I hope you enjoy it.
and what do you expect to come from that meeting? And also, can you explain why you think Starmer is more radical than Tony Blair?
I don't have any idea what will come from it. Very little usually comes from these meetings. There's still a powerful illusion in England that we're a special friend of the United States and we have a special relationship and that Americans care about us a lot, which is complete rubbish. We're nobodies, but also this ridiculous idea that we can be a bridge between Europe and the USA, which again is not remotely true. So we fantasize about these meetings and think it makes us important. I don't. So I should probably be doing something else when the news comes in of Sir Keir Starmer's visit. But others are welcome to be interested if they want to. But I didn't say he's more radical than Blair. He is pretty much from the same place as Blair. I mean, Blair revealed himself to have been long after he'd ceased to be in power. Revealed himself to have been a student Trotskyist, a fact which, if it had been known at any time during his political career, would have almost certainly prevented him from becoming prime minister. I also know from research that quite a large part of his cabinet were student Trotskyists or communists, none of whom have ever talked about it or showed any particular sign of rejecting the revolutionary past. So the New Labour is broadly a Euro-communist movement and has been since, well, they say the middle 1990s, and Blair was part of that. Starmer is from the same sort of thing, but he has what we know of his specific past, has a slightly more developed Marxist, even Trotskyist and fascinatingly Pabloite character. The person I said that he was more radical than was Jeremy Corbyn, the unfortunate steam-powered old Trotskyist who was leader of the Labour Party before him, and who everybody stood back from and said, gosh, look at this man, he's a terrifying revolutionary. Poor old Jeremy Corbyn couldn't have revolutionized a roulette wheel, but he was not, he wasn't serious because everybody knew what he was. The thing about modern revolutionaries is they don't look like revolutionaries. They don't have bandoliers around their necks and they all wear fatigues or long beards or wave red flags. They wear nice suits and they speak in modulated tones, and they are apparently rational, but they're revolutionaries. This was the thing about the Blair Revolution and about Keir Starmer. That's what he is. He's a modern radical of the sort of Saul Alinsky pattern, where you accept that if you're actually going to get power, you have to dress and work and speak as if you're part of the mainstream, and that's what they've done. It works.
I think the tension for people on the left is that sounds great to them. They would love, a socialist minded, a communist minded leader in office, right? But I feel like Starmer has more elite support than he ever has any kind of grassroots left support. Do you think that's true?
I've no idea, not being either in the elite or the grassroots. What I know is that he is prime minister, and he won a substantial majority in parliament, and that's it. But I don't. What the old left is, well, it's lost its raison d'etre. The world is not as it was, and there was a time when poverty had a different characters of what it has now, and where the issues were far plainer and far simpler for decent people, and social democracy was an immensely appealing path for people to take. And that's gone. And social democracy has tried to change the world and has actually created new problems which we face. None of that it's not even very interesting.
Peter, you've been so
I mean, look at left-wing magazines. What do they write about? What are the issues they have to make up things to get excited about, because all the great evil dragons of the 20th century in the rich countries have been slain. And people who we have in Britain, we have universal healthcare, we have public housing, we have an enormously elaborate welfare state and safety net to pick up people. It still doesn't work, but we have all these things. when socialism was a what you call a grassroots movement, we didn't have them, and people could look around them and see a society both unjust and squalid, which they couldn't tolerate.
Peter, thank you for being so generous with your time. It's really been a pleasure talking to you. We've been joking on the podcast about how long Trump will last or who he'll throw under the bus first. Do you have any thoughts on this?
Well, no, I think, as I say, he's cunning. He did a very clever thing, whether it was his own idea or his advisors, of being extremely active in his first few hours of office and giving a strong impression of momentum, which is anybody who works the democratic system and comes into power on a majority of any kind has a very short time in which to show that they mean business. And he's certainly done that very effectively. I wouldn't underestimate him. I simply would not underestimate his cunning. The most interesting thing about Donald Trump is the succession. The other interesting thing is whether the ferocity of his actions will actually lead to a rebirth of what you might call the American left, the Democratic Party, which currently seems to me to be a pretty poor thing. That he might actually create an opposition as vigorous as he is. Who knows? I don't know. It's a mystery to me.
Peter, thanks so much again. I'm sorry, I do have one last question. Are you working on anything new? A new book?
Well, I am, but it's for various reasons of domestic crisis. I'm not working on it very hard at the moment, which is I finally got, after it being turned down by existing publisher and everybody else I talked to, a contract to write a book called The Madness of Cars, about the catastrophic decision taken by Western civilization around about the beginning of the 20th century to rely on privately owned motor cars, which to me are just mechanized ox carts, as the principal means of transport in civilized cities. It seems to me to be the most terrible mistake, disastrous to both to civilization, the destruction which it's visited on our cities and our countryside, the waste of it, the dependence on horrible Middle Eastern despotisms for fuel, and the sheer inefficiency of it is just astounding. And yet nobody even thinks about it. And I just thought it was time that they did. And it seems to me to be, who was it who called cars mechanical Jacobins? Was it Oakeshott? It was one of the conservative thinkers. Absolutely right. Cars do the most tremendous damage to civilization and to civil society and to courtesy. And they're also they're the most perfect demonstration of Lord Acton's maxim about the tendency of power to corrupt. Most people only experience power as the driver of a car. And people who are perfectly nice and civilized and good-mannered, put them behind a wheel of a motor car and they become madmen. It's really, really strange phenomenon. Look at all this, because a car parked in my street at the moment, which it's huge. In this small Oxford Street, it's a gigantic car. It's called Ranger. And this is subtitled Wild Track, spelt wrong. It's a car. It's a thing that gets stuck in traffic jams, just like everything else, but it has to be called a Ranger, as if it was tremendously wild and roaming. And Wild Track was an expression of its owner's masculinity. This is madness. And it is madness, and it's time it was examined, because it's done so much. We could so easily have done differently. The whole history of Los Angeles is a fascinating part of this. It was, if you look at that wonderful film Double Indemnity, the opening scenes, you'll see streetcar lines running down the streets of Los Angeles. It was completely carpeted with streetcars. And you read the novels of Raymond Chandler, and Philip Marlowe is always hearing interurbans and streetcars in the distance. And the city now totally given over to mechanized ox carts and freeways. And it's much, much less civilized now than it was then. As you look at any picture of any Edwardian city, the cities of 110 or so years ago in North America or Europe, when they were still tending towards the steel wheel, steel rail, electrically powered form of transport, it was just so much more civilized. And it's actually the First World War did so much to destroy that. And let's not even mention the railroads, or we'll be here all night.
Wait, so no autobiography or memoir in the plans?
Good Lord, no.
You're denying us. You're denying us some great reading.
You can find, there are references to me, because I am quite vain, there are references to me and my life in quite a lot of my books. I think I had to make do with that. Otherwise, I'm sure my enemies will provide any details that you feel you lack.
Peter, thank you so much for your time. It's really been a treat.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you,
Bye.
Peter.
Thank you.
Wow. That was our conversation with Peter. He was so generous with his time. Great conversation. And once again, I can't believe that people trust us not to cut off the interviews and make them look like fools.
Thanks for listening. This has been Building for All Seasons. Like and subscribe. I'm Andrew.
I'm Dan.
And I'm Ben.
Thanks for listening. Like, subscribe, do all those things that people do.
Smash that share button.
Like and share.